today I want to briefly present kind of an overview of the literature. So I've done two studies a few years ago about Germany's paradigm shift in family policies, but I kind of thought, all right, my studies are already a little dated, and I really want to give you a broader overview of what other people more recently also found with regards to different outcomes of this policy change. So I'll first talk about briefly summarizing how family policies have changed in Germany, and then briefly clarifying the implicit or explicit conceptual framework that actually most studies have used. And then specifically, I will talk about the literature, what has been found so far on whether parental leave policies have increased, the change in parental leave policies have increased social inequalities, what have been the findings for parents as well as for children, and then similarly, what have been the effects of the early childhood education and care expansion on social inequalities, again, in terms of take-up as well as child development. And in the end, I'll try to conclude with kind of some discussing the findings so far. So the German family policy up to the mid-2000s has been described as supported familialism. And I think many of you probably will be aware of this conceptualization of the familialization is basically different policies, how they impact the degree of dependence or independence on family relationships, kind of relying on the care provided by other family members. And here, in terms of the supported familialism, the important pieces of policies of that category were basically that there is still, and there was and is, a joint taxation for couples. It's that kind of a tax splitting system that is taxing second earners more highly, therefore disadvantaging their labor market participation. Then there is still a right to return to your previous job, so parental leave, even if it's still unpaid, but it is still for 3 years after the birth of a child. And before the most recent policies, there was a means-tested child rearing benefit for up to 2 years, and it was relatively low paid, so around €300 a month. There was an entitlement to a half-day early childhood education and care place, but only from the age of 3 of the child. And for under 3s, the availability was very low. And this sort of, as we know, this parental leave and childcare model really led to mothers taking very long interruptions from the labor market after having a child. However, the fees were relatively low for early childhood education and care service, and they still are in European comparison. And they are also mostly income dependent. So they really depend on your household income in all states now, and also for most of the expansion time. And we also know Germany is one of the contributors to the part-time worker model for mothers, where this is really was and still is the predominant model for mothers to combine work and family. Now, what has happened in terms of policies in the late 2000s was basically that the provision of childcare expanded massively, as we heard yesterday from Agnes, with 2 different laws. And basically these laws then stipulated a legal entitlement for all children from the age of 1, which started in August 2013. And there's also some sort of need-based expansion of full day care, but full day care is still expanding more slowly. Then in 2007, there was an important parental leave reform, which reduced the length of paid leave to 12 months per parent, and introduced an income-dependent reimbursement of about between 2/3 and 100%, depending on your income, and of course, with some cap, and an individual entitlement for both parents, also called, I think, in many contexts, the daddy month, or so the fathers were also entitled to leave, and in total, parents could now take 14 months of leave if they share it between them. And the objectives were pretty clear in terms it was supposed to speed up maternal labor market return and increase fathers' involvement in childcare, but also generally improve the reconciliation of work and family. And here, this is the important part where social inequality comes in. It was supposed to promote early child development irrespective of social background. So meaning also children from less disadvantaged backgrounds were supposed to be increasingly entitled and taking up early childhood education and care. So what I'm trying to do here is basically to look at parental leave policies as well as early childhood education and care policies, how they developed in Germany, and then specifically look now at the effects on social inequality for child development as well as for maternal employment and fathers' take-up of leave and childcare involvement. Now, I will really focus here on the social inequality aspect. Of course, there are a lot more studies on different other outcomes, but otherwise the presentation would be too long. So these sorts of reforms, basically what they did was create greater choice. It was partly an unintended consequence, but partly also simply a political compromise that on the one hand, many of the traditional policies were left in place. So still very long leave entitlement, even if mostly unpaid now, still a tax splitting model. And at the same time, the policy introduced now kind of a more progressive family policy model that aimed at a greater gender equality, kind of following the Scandinavian model. And that, of course, created more choice, if you want to put it that way. But that also means probably, therefore, more social inequality because different groups of parents choose differently. And now the question is that only the case temporarily, basically between family policy models that transform and kind of change gender norms, change care norms, would they then kind of converge again to some sort of new universal model, or will that sort of social divergence and social inequality kind of remain a more permanent feature of the German work care arrangements? And that's basically the underlying question that I, in the end, try to answer a little bit with this review of the different studies that have been conducted over the past, in the meantime, 13 years since most of these policy changes happened. Now, just to clarify, I'm not going to go into detail into any of these conceptual models, but basically the accommodation model of parental work care choices is what is the underlying assumed framework that most of these policy studies and evaluations apply in one way or the other. They assume that parents face time and budget constraints, they maximize their utility, both in terms of working and caring and their children's development. But importantly here for social inequality, this sort of framework assumes that information and preferences are stratified, socially stratified by location, by education groups. So graphically, you could put it like that on the one hand, mothers and fathers' resources in terms of education, income, culture, ethnicity, and we also partly looked at single parents in terms of time and budget constraints, then that they would shape preferences and identities as workers and carers, and of course also partly the knowledge people have about the specific system in a country, and then that would shape the length of leave they take and the work hours they choose and the different aspects of their childcare arrangement. So that's just very roughly, that's kind of the underlying assumption, I think, of many of these studies. And I will not go too much into detail, but for some studies that then look at the reasons, the underlying reasons for the social inequalities, I might come back to that. So this is from here, graph of the development of mothers' employment with children under 3 years by educational qualifications over the time period from the late 90s to about 2011 to 13. So when most of the change in parental leave and childcare expansion happened. And you can see that here we have 4 different periods. This is based on data from the socioeconomic panel in Germany. And here you can see that on the left, West Germany, on the right, East Germany. And basically you see that in both of these regions, we see that the mothers with high education, the red lines, we see that there is a very strong increases in maternal employment. Also the mothers with medium education, so vocational training, in the light blue lines, clearly you see a positive trend over that time period. Whereas the low educated with less than a vocational training qualification, the dark blue lines in West Germany, they basically stagnate. Their employment stagnates over that time period. And in East Germany, it even decreases in the first periods and then goes up slightly again to the baseline level, which is due to increasing unemployment in these phases. So now I want to briefly review a little bit. So what did these policies do to mothers' employment? So in the short term, it was actually found that social inequality decreased slightly because there was a stronger incentive for all mothers, including highly educated mothers, to really take a full year of leave. Whereas in the second and third year, the less educated mothers actually started to return earlier to the labor market, and more strongly so than the highly educated. But then it turned out that the highly educated mothers, when you look at them at their position 3 to 5 years after the birth, only they could really find some sort of kind of good, high quality part-time job, because they returned increasingly to the same employer, and they were able to were more likely to hold permanent contracts than they were before the reform. Whereas this was not the case for less educated mothers. So in the end, again, for maternal employment, we found actually the parental leave reform led to increasing inequalities. When you look at the longer term labor market position, this insider-outsider position, then for take-up of parental leave by fathers, we found very strong increases in take-up. So before the reform, only 3% of fathers took any parental leave in Germany. Then it increased briefly after the reform to 21% in 2008. And then most recently in 2018, it was 42% of fathers taking any leave. However, keep in mind, it's still less than a half of fathers taking any leave. And the very large majority, about 80% of fathers, still only take the 2 months that are kind of their individual entitlement that would be lost to the family. And interestingly, the main reasons given in surveys asking them why they're not taking leave, the main reasons are not that the family cannot afford it, but it's mainly due to mothers preferring to take a full 12 months of leave, and fathers fearing career penalties, especially in male-dominated industries. Now, in terms of social stratification of take-up, we do see that fathers with higher education have increased their leave take-up much more strongly than fathers with no university degree or only vocational training. So there is a clear divergence in the patterns of the kind of gender division of parental leave. And as we find that parental leave take-up of fathers also has been found to increase childcare involvement, and the reform per se also increased childcare involvement of fathers, we can also see some indication of divergence in terms of parental childcare involvement, with higher educated fathers getting more involved over time. Now, looking at effects on child development and parents' kind of work-family balance, interestingly here for parental subjective well-being, kind of life satisfaction, we see very positive effects of the parental leave reform across all socioeconomic groups. There was no effects on social inequality in this respect. For child development, interestingly, there was also a very recent study by Hübner et al. Found a very well-identified null effect. So really an effect very close to zero on all social groups across all social strata, with register data for 5-year-old children in one German state. So that actually suggests that there hasn't been any significant impact on social inequality among children. And it's, of course, so far, it's a bit unclear whether the increasing take-up by highly educated fathers of the leave and increasing involvement in their childcare, whether that might actually lead to greater inequality in child development. So far, there haven't been any studies on this. Now, for the early childhood education and care expansion that Agnes showed us yesterday graphically very nicely, here we do see, again, increasing social inequalities in maternal employment. So, and that is partly the result of increased part-time employment, especially in West Germany, but also increased full-time employment among medium and highly skilled mothers. And in East Germany, there actually haven't been any great effects on maternal employment, and this is probably due to generally poorer job prospects and lower quality of early childhood education and care. Interestingly, also maybe relating it to the first presentation today, that early childhood education and care, the expansion and the take-up have actually already shown to benefit the integration of refugee mothers in terms of their language skills as well as their employment prospects. So in terms of increasing social inequality in use of the expanding early childhood education and care services, in one of my studies in 2017, again, the graph looks very similar to the maternal employment patterns that I showed earlier. Basically, strong increases for the highly educated mothers in their take-up of childcare, for under 3-year-old children, some increases for the medium-skilled mothers, and basically no increases for the low-skilled mothers in East Germany, and only very slow increases for the low-skilled in West Germany. And part of that at the time was due to the childcare take-up. One condition, or at least a priority, was given to working parents, which of course would be less likely to apply to the lower educated mothers. But that was totally abolished as soon as the legal entitlement came in 2013. So from that period on, anybody, irrespective of employment status of the mother or the father, would be entitled to a childcare place. And here is basically in these charts that I've taken from a recent study by Jessen et al. They showed what happened to different education groups and different immigrant groups in terms of their take-up. And here you can see in the top graph the highly educated mothers, and the green line is basically showing still a continuing increase of take-up. Whereas for the mothers, the brown line, with mothers with vocational training in the brown line, and there is a pretty stable trend of take-up. But we also see for the lowest educated, the orange line, some increases in their take-up since 2013, since the legal entitlement was introduced. And by immigrant background, we do see some slight increases for families where one parent has an immigration background. Whereas if both parents have an immigration background, there is only a very, very slow increase in the take-up. So there is a pretty big gap in kind of take-up rates among between parents with a migration background and without, and between the low educated parents and the higher educated parents. And for both, for 1 and for 2-year-olds, it's at around 20%. So the gap in who wants to actually take up a place and says in the survey, yes, they would like to take up and register for a place, but at the same time, they didn't get any. So around 20% of all groups generally didn't get any places that they would like. So the demand is still exceeding the supply, and there are clear socioeconomic differences in this excess demand. So lower educated mothers show much higher levels of excess demand than mothers with higher education, and the same for families with an immigrant background, or where both parents in particular have an immigrant background. They show about 25% of excess demand. And this is relatively stable. So this has not decreased from 2012, the gray bars, to 2016, which would be the brown bars. So what are the reasons? Only in the recent years, really, there have been some studies which were pretty good in trying to get at these reasons for the persistent social inequalities in take-up of early childhood education and care. And here we could see that in one German state that abolished the fees completely, then we saw a catch-up effect of these lower educated mothers in taking up childcare. So, and also in the regions where the early childhood education and care availability kind of expanded faster and was more met the demand, there also these sorts of gaps closed. So we can assume that actually lowering fees and continuing expansion of early childhood education and care provision will close the gap for families with lower education, but not for families with immigrant backgrounds. So these in Germany, these measures have not shown to be effective to close the gap for those families. And instead, here, what seems to be important is making the registration and the allocation systems easier, having local access, what also Mara mentioned yesterday. So really, they have a strong need for childcare provision in their very local surrounding. And some of them also have very strong preferences for bilingual educators, which of course is not generally available in Germany yet. In terms of actual quality differences, in terms of different groups, in 2 papers, we actually found only very modest differences so some of the low educated families and families with a migration background had some access to kind of less high quality in respect to a few important characteristics, but on the whole, these differences were very small because we looked at a very large number of characteristics of early childhood education and care centers in Germany. Now, in terms of what do we think did the early childhood education and care expansion mean for social disparities in child development? So the interesting thing for Germany is that actually early childhood education and care for under threes does not seem to benefit highly educated or even medium educated families and their children in terms of child development very much. So on the whole, it simply makes no difference whether or not they attend a childcare center, because the quality is also relatively mediocre. However, for children, so far, the largest benefits really seem to accrue to children with an immigrant background in terms of learning the German language. And this was found by a lot of, several studies, and also one study that modeled actually the effects of the expansion, also mostly found that the largest positive effects were for children with an immigrant background, and partly also on socio-emotional skills of children with a lower educated or immigrant parent. There was a small positive effect also on motor skills of children across all SES groups, but that was kind of small compared to the other effects. So on the whole, I think for children's development, we might conclude that progressively expanding early childhood education and care system, if it continues aiming at universal access, it is likely to actually reduce social inequalities in Germany. Okay, now I would like to conclude and kind of discuss a little bit what that means. So on the whole, I think I clearly showed, and more recent study confirmed, that the move to optional familialism contributed to increasing social inequalities in Germany in maternal employment, in paternal leave take-up, and in general take-up of early childhood education and care services, but not in terms of child outcomes. So it didn't actually compromise child outcomes so far. There has been a recent legislation in 2020 kind of to generally improve quality in daycare. And here they actually are specifically aiming at not generally improving quality, but also facilitating registration also for immigrants, and generally reducing costs and making costs even more means tested or income dependent. So I think as a result of that, we could hope that also the gap in the take-up of families with an immigrant background would be reduced. So, however, these sort of EC3 expansion and this improvement in the system are unlikely to actually do anything about maternal employment, because at least in my reading of the literature and the data so far is that this maternal employment really, there will be increasing or at least stagnating social inequality in maternal employment because of still very slowly changing gender norms in Germany, especially among the lower educated groups, and kind of diverging gender norms, and also the labor market prospects. And I think that's something we always have to keep in mind. Many of these women are not in very attractive jobs. So returning to the labor market soon is actually not, at the moment, clearly not their first interest. They have a very strong interest in taking long paid leave. And therefore, this remains socially stratified, and their preferences remain socially stratified at the moment. And more so, in my view, than childcare ideals. So the childcare ideals seem to be changing much faster in Germany, in the sense that taking up formal early childhood education and care center is kind of getting more and more accepted quickly among all socioeconomic groups, even though, of course, the highly educated kind of started taking them up faster. And there have been a few kind of reforms also in terms of implementing a bonus for a partner for gender equality in terms of parental leave take-up, or setting incentives if both parents, mothers and fathers, work long time while they take parental leave. But all of these actually changed very little about the overall trends in kind of gender equality or social inequalities in the take-up of leave and subsequent labor market engagement. So I think my conclusion would be the change towards optional familialism in Germany has been clearly associated with raising social inequalities, and not only temporarily. And this also, I think politically, it's at the moment not acceptable to move more strongly towards, again, one family model, but it seems to be some sort of political compromise to promote or at least allow different family models among different social groups. And that, of course, means for maternal employment and paternal take-up of leave, we probably will see some continuing social inequality. Whereas I think for child development, actually, Germany so far managed to reduce, at least to have no significant penalty for child development, and possibly even with expanding access of early childhood education care, it might even contribute to reducing social inequalities in that domain. Well, thank you very much. I really look forward to any questions and to the discussion.